are live, and I have to see if everything's smooth because with the coronavirus going around, the everybody's on Twitch, everybody's watching,
Everybody's
and
soaking up bandwidth, and
exactly.
not
So
necessarily as for as good a reason as we are soaking up bandwidth.
exactly. Not everybody is out here talking tank and getting shit done.
Yeah,
So
we should send out a message that now we are talking about tanks. Please release your bandwidth.
everybody stop like streaming shit off of Netflix and come talk tank.
Stop streaming inferior subjects. It's time to talk about tanks.
That's obviously what's out there that is top tier content to be learning and listening from. So we'll give people a minute to kind of come on in, and that way, because people with streams, if you start talking a lot from the beginning, people then have got a bunch of questions about shit you already talked about. So because we'll be halfway into Panzer 2 and people will be like, who is this guy? So we'll give it a minute.
Well, we can go back.
Yeah, we sure can. We can. This is I like that this. I was actually. It does say images of war and it talks about photographs, but I was surprised about how much of this book actually is pictures. So.
Oh yeah, it's a photo book. I mean, that's one of the attractions of it. I mean, it's a strange balance because it does have some text.
Which I think
Like,
is it's apropos though. It's not like.
yeah, but I mean, it has chapters, and the chapters are 2 pages long, and then you got lots and lots of photographs again. So sometimes you think, oh, the chapter's worth it. Let's have more photographs. But you know, you want lots, big captions, I think, and then you can get away with chapters. That's a publishing choice.
Okay, that makes
We
sense
can
though.
talk about that. We can talk about that later.
I think so too. Yeah, that would probably be a good like overview. Look at all that. Oh, and they're very full. I don't get that on the PDF because it's a PDF, but they're
The,
very. Those
yeah,
look
yeah,
nice.
it's good quality. I mean, it's good paper, and the resolution is good, and the things that you notice. What was important with old photographs about tanks is because they're often fuzzy in the first place. You want to be sure that you're getting the best resolution that's appropriate for the photographs, and
Right.
you're certainly getting that. I'm showing myself instead of you, but the tone is right. It's good paper, like I said.
Nice. Those
It's
it
a fun
seems like
book.
small details, but I think that it matters for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah,
No,
like obviously the content itself is going to be the priority in a book, but I mean, shit, the way the paper looks and the way that the photos are, all that does matter. So
yeah.
awesome, cool. Well, okay, so we'll go ahead and do our introduction now. We've got some folks. They've seen the word. They've received the notifications on social and in their emails about our stream tonight. So it's a bit of a pop-up surprise. But I would like to invite Bruce Newsom back to my stream to do some tank talking with you guys. We have received copies of some new books for review purposes. And I got a PDF. He's got a real copy plus the PDF. So we're going to show off some of its features tonight and recommendations in one way or another, as well as some advice and maybe take some questions if we can. So we'll go ahead and show you our opinion of kind of how it went and get to see some really cool stuff actually. So thank you once again for coming on my little show, Bruce.
I am always happy to talk with you, Sophie. I'm delighted to be here. As I said last time, what better way to take your mind off a lockdown in an emergency than to get together remotely and talk about tanks?
Hell yeah, best way to burn the time. So can I first ask you what got you interested in reviewing this particular book in particular?
So, well, light tanks. It's light tanks. You don't get many books on light tanks. It's sort of an under-attended class of tanks. So people want to look at the big stuff and the main battle tanks. But light tanks, they get neglected. When they do get any attention, it's usually in an encyclopedia, say, of German tanks. Here are the light tanks, and let's move on to the medium and heavy tanks. But this book is dedicated to the light tanks, and you could learn a lot from a book like this because it's going to go into the details and maybe show some rarer variants of the tanks, which you would not see in a typical general knowledge book about German tanks. So I like the focus of this. And then, the publisher's promise was that we were going to get rare photographs we haven't seen. And that's generally true in this book. Most of these photographs I've never seen before. And some of them are pretty special in the variants they show. Like field modifications, which I haven't seen before. There's a lot. There's a lot to learn from a little book. It's a little book, but it's focused and it's dedicated, and then the author has made some effort to show you new things, and there's a lot to be taken from a little book like this. When it's delivered right, when it delivers on its promise, it can be a book that is like it's worth a place on your shelf, because there are very few books that focus on this subject.
Gotcha. Okay. So what are some things as you read over it? Because I read over this one, and I had some things that kind of caught my eye that I was like, dang, I'm actually really glad I have this, and I'm definitely interested in showing this off. Because there are some favorites that you get. You get like those little ones that kind of catch your eye and that you're like, oh, wow, I would like to see some more of that. So, kind of, what are some things that stood out to you that you were like, I'm actually glad that I got a copy of this because of that?
Yeah, it's I said it's a little book. It's reasonably stacked with photographs. So we've got 125 pages, and there's I would say there's an average of 2 photographs per page. So you're getting on for 200 photographs. I mean, that's a big investment for a publisher. What he says up front, the author says up front, this book is going to focus on the Panzer I, the Panzer II, and the 2 Czech tanks that the Germans use, so the 35T and the 38T. And it goes further, it goes all the way through the war, so it shows the variants. So the later variants that included some pretty serious anti-tank self-propelled guns, like the Hetzer and the Marders, and also the self-propelled howitzers like the Vespa, the Wasp, the self-propelled 105 millimeter. So there's a lot of variants to consider in the histories of these tanks, and the author does a fair job of giving attention to all of those variants. And then, like I said earlier, the photographs impressed me because there's a lot here that are pretty special. Clearly, the photographs are generally taken from veterans, the crewmen themselves, who are taking photographs of their own tanks, which is always, I mean, to me, that's the best form of photograph, because it's by the users of the user's natural conditions of their natural use of the tank. So they're not posed propaganda shots, and they're not enemy shots of destroyed tanks, and often the destroyed tanks are faked, right? So the propagandist fakes how the tank was destroyed, sets fire to it all over again, pretends to capture prisoners. So there's a lot of fakery in enemy photographs of German tanks. But almost all these photographs are by crewmen of their own tanks. So there's that authenticity.
Yeah.
Right. So there's a battlefield shot.
Which page is that one on?
So this is page 6262, and it actually shows a 38T, Panzer 38T, advancing over a battlefield, and it actually doesn't try to guess where that battlefield is, but by the looks of it, that's got to be the Soviet Union early in the war, so late summer 1941, I would say. So page 62 that was. So that's an illustration of the sort of photographs I value. So user photographs in combat, or at least on operations, so you get the authenticity of how these tanks were used. And it goes from the beginning of the war to the end of the war. That's one of the advantages of focusing on these particular light tanks, because at least in terms of their variants, their history goes the whole length of the war. So actually their history goes from 1932 to 1945 because of the Panzer I. The one caveat I have to put to that is that most of these photographs are taken in the Balkans or Russia. There's actually nothing. You can tell me if you spotted any from Africa, but I didn't spot any from Africa, and I think that's a major oversight, because the light tanks had a lot of fighting to do in Africa, because North Africa, because of the period of time that campaign was going on. So early 1941 to mid-1943, that covers a period where the Germans were still using a lot of light tanks as primary tanks, and then their variants were coming in as self-propelled mounting. So, and in a lot of ways, the North African desert was possibly a better environment for light tanks than, say, at least the Eastern Front's marshes and forests, where you would need heavier, better armored tanks for close quarters battle.
Right.
In North Africa, where your distances, your operational distances are very long, you want lighter tanks for less fuel consumption, longer operational range, and you want speed too, because they're going to race in and race out, where there's not much cover. So so speed is more important in the desert. So light tanks, I was excited to see some new insight into how light tanks were used in Africa, and there's pretty much nothing on light tanks in Africa, which is an oversight. Maybe the author could do a volume which is light tanks in Africa. That would be good.
Yeah, I think there would certainly be enough material to kind of cover a separate volume that it would be worth doing on his part. I would agree with that recommendation. Yeah.
But you got big scope. You got a neglected topic, light tanks. You got the whole scope of the war. Actually, there's a lot of photographs from before the war. So you see German crews training with Panzer Is and Twos, and some of the 35Ts, 38Ts before the war, and that's interesting because there are insights there into how the Germans developed their Panzer force. And I'll add, that's nice to see, because typically, although we want to see wartime operational shots, there's a lot we want to know about the peacetime period of development before the war. So how were these tanks being used on maneuvers in training before the war? How were they structured, and how were they mixed with other weapons and things like that? That's interesting in itself. So the peacetime development of the Panzer Force is interesting in itself historically, and then but it also has implications for the wartime use of the vehicle. So what did they learn and decide during peacetime that affected how they use these tanks in wartime? So I'm glad that he has these peacetime shots too.
Yeah, I really like, as you mentioned, sort of the authenticity of the photos, like crews doing stuff with them, but it's not set up, and it's really nice that he would have sourced these from like more personal collections instead of like government archives that involve a lot of sort of the propaganda side of that.
Right. That's very important, getting it from the crews. I mean, just to note, the author, does not tell you anywhere where he gets these photographs. So there's no credits to any archive or anything like that. So, I mean, I presume that he's canvassed these from veterans' personal archives or the unit associations, the veterans' historical associations or whatever they call them for the units that have reposed photographs that have been donated by the veterans as they've passed on. They've willed their photographs to some veterans association or some unit's historical society or something like that. But it's interesting, the author does not credit any of the photographs, so you cannot chase up where a particular photograph interests you. You can't chase it up. I mean, or maybe the author owns them all. I don't know. Maybe he's just done a lot of purchasing, and he owns all of these. I don't know.
Very possible.
We should clarify. We don't know, because we don't know the author. Neither of us knows this author. We got to know. I mean, that's important to say, because we don't have any stake in this. There's no interest for us to sell you this book,
right?
Or tell you not to buy it. We don't know the author. I mean, it's been sent to us by the publisher so that we can talk about it honestly. We have no stake in this.
So kind of overall so you have authored many books on tanks from World War II and from As the expert here, but also from the viewpoint as the author, would you say to people to recommend this book, yes or no, but also why? Like, sort of for the casual tank dork like myself, like, would this be valuable in a collection? Can you trust this information, yes and no, and what do you think and why?
Right, so, well, my preference, because I'm an evidence-based historian, so it's very important to me that the facts are correct. So one of my criteria is it's got to be accurate. So I'm not going to recommend this to anybody if it's peddling misleading information. Or another thing I would be looking at, which is related to this, is does it have an agenda? Like, is it trying to push an agenda? Like, is it trying to sell you on some bias? Does it have some mistaken preconception about these tanks or something like that? So that if I see that, I'm not going to recommend the book, because the industry, the publishing on history, is dominated by people with agendas. So you can randomly pick up a book and find a bad agenda and lots of errors in it. That could just be sloppy research, but often it's driven by agendas. People are trying to push some nationalist interpretation of the war, or some some favorite author's interpretation of the war. If people have biases, some of them are unconscious because just they've always read this historian, they believe that historian, and they haven't checked the facts for themselves. So I'm looking for accuracy, and as it happens, this book is pretty accurate. There are some errors in the book, actually, and I can show you some of those. But let me talk about the second criteria, which really matters to me, and that is whether there is something original in the book. So it's not enough for a new book to come along and say, I'm going to tell you all about Germany's tanks, and I'm just going to repeat what everybody else has told you about Germany's tanks, because there's no original content there. And this series, so this is called the Images of War series. The publisher here is Casemate, and again, we don't have any interest in the publisher Casemate. That just happens to be the publisher. Images of War series. The claim that the publisher makes is that they're going to show you photographs you haven't seen before. So that's original content, and that can be historically useful, where we see the crews using their weapons in a way that hasn't been shown before, right? So that would be new primary evidence, and you would only get that from looking at new photographs, these photographs, rather than photographs you see over and over and over and again in the books, the typical books, because those are the ones that are handed to the author by the archives, because they can't be bothered to go and search for photographs that are actually more pertinent and unused. So by that criterion, this book does well on that. So it's got these. I've never seen most of the photographs in this book, and I think that relates to my assumption that these are photographs taken by crewmen, and held as private property until publication here. So we haven't seen them in the archives, and then they're not in the typical books. So as original content, I'd recommend it on particularly that criterion. You're going to find about 200 photographs, that's my estimate, 200 photographs, almost all of which you haven't seen in another book. And it's very rare that we can say that about a book, that there's genuinely new content. This is a photo book, and you're going to have something new to peruse in almost all of those photographs. So that's very attractive. That's a book we can have on our shelf and go back to when we want to reconsider German light tanks.
Cool. Yeah, like as you mentioned, I really like these sort of casual, interesting photographs. For what it's worth, I haven't seen these either, so it's definitely, this is nice. But as you mentioned, there are some errors. What are the errors in these ones that you've picked up?
Well, there's some really odd identification errors, and I say it's odd because the author's really well informed about some of these variants. So he will point out. Let me give you an example. So because this is right up front, so he's really good on Panzer ones. So if we look at page 8, these are the first photographs in the book, page 8. He identifies the difference between the Panzer I models A and B, and he highlights, some of them are missing these mud guards, or they've got odd stowage and things like that, right? So these are details that only somebody who has studied these photographs and considered and has developed awareness of what is a normal stowage arrangement, only that sort of author would spot that. So the author is generally technically accurate and insightful. However, there's some odd misidentifications. I'll give you page. This is going to be page 78, 78. So there's a Panzer II in the middle of that photograph, and for some reason he says it's a 38T, which is particularly odd because those tanks are most different. So 38T has the four big wheels each side on leaf springs, and
the turret shape is totally identifiable compared to for something like.
Yeah, and there is actually a 38T on the opposite page on 79. So it's quite incongruous. It's quite incongruous that it's clearly a Panzer II here and it's a 38T here, and they're both being identified as 38T. That's just, it doesn't mean the authors. That doesn't prove that the author doesn't know the difference. It's just it's like an editorial error. It's just the author or the editor of the series has skipped over, hasn't read the captions properly and checked and really thought about every detail being correct. Is it really correct? Because I can tell you this as an author. You work over you read over your own work, and you're not paying attention because you wrote it.
Yeah.
But as a self-reviewer of your own work, you have to learn how to read your own work posing as an ignorant reader. So a reader has never read your work before. That's how you pick up errors. Okay. You've got to read it. You're reading it for the first time. So there's some odd errors like that, but those are odd errors that wouldn't disqualify a recommendation of this book, because you can work out from the other photographs that that's not a Panzer 38T, that's a Panzer II, because you can work that out from the other photographs. It's just annoying occasionally because it means you have to pay attention. You can't completely rely on the captions, so it's kind of annoying like that. But
they're pretty few and far between, though. It's not so often that it's distracting or like, God, he doesn't know what he's doing or something. It seems like this guy is definitely put in the work. But for the most part, like you said, it could easily be sort of an editorial error instead of him just not recognizing it or something like that.
Yeah, it's like an oversight. It's not an error of knowledge. I think it's an error of knowledge. I mean, I think the author can pick this up and say, oh, damn it, I didn't think when I didn't reread that properly. It's that the author surely knows that that's not a 38T. It's just an oversight. I mean, I can give you a comparison. So this book, it's actually some of the same errors. For me, the errors are text state, and it's way off. And those are errors of fact that are not, for me, they're not allowable because they're they're dates, and they're like the calibers of guns.
Okay,
Things
yeah.
like that. There's just too many errors like that. You're not getting routine errors of fact in this sort of book. So yeah, this is a book I'd recommend. I mean, we should add a caveat about the price, because there are great books that I would recommend if they were different prices. But I'd say that there are some fantastic thick hardcover books on panzers, and they cost $100. And I'm much as I love the photographs, I'm not going to recommend anybody pays that much. So we have when I say I recommend this book, I have to add the parameters here. So this is on the back cover. It's what do you call this? List price. So this price is $23, so $22.95. And on Amazon, it's going at, was it $14.95? Is that right?
Yeah, or so for paperback or something, but it's $10 on Kindle, and I'm like, $10? That's quite decent, for sure.
Right. Well, 200 photographs on your computer for $10.
Yeah.
I think that's good value.
Even so, like, even if you say it's $20, but it's $1 a photo of something that you've never seen before is actually really nice, especially for something, as you mentioned, that doesn't really get a lot of time in the sun compared to your tigers and stuff like that. Like, you really can't find that much information. Even for myself, like, from my own viewpoint as just the tank dork, like, I'm trying to learn, I'm trying to find stuff. It's not going to be as easy to find information like this about light tanks and photos like this about light tanks, because people are really busy sharing the same photos of Tiger 1 and Tiger 2 over and over again. So something that is like, okay, wow, this is actually completely like sort of, this is new stuff for me, and it would be for me it's worth it. And that's going to vary, and it's not, you can mention as part of a recommendation, unless it's ridiculous, like you mentioned, $100 hardcover book. It sort of doesn't, it's not going to weight as part of a recommendation as much, but it's worth saying, like, hey, it's a good deal. It mentions, like, for somebody who is, like, kind of new to the specific subject, I think that there's enough in their little chapters. Little chapters. There's not very much text in this book, but there's enough to kind of give, from my point of view, which is not the expert point of view. Okay, good. So what am I going to be thinking with this? And as you mentioned, it does mention, like, a little bit with the France and the Low Countries, and it mentions there's a lot in here about the use in the Russian territories, but it doesn't mention any Africa. But again, it talks a little bit about the development of light tanks and kind of the early implementation, which is enough for, like, in the beginning part of the book, like, okay, good, this is what we're talking about. If you're not an expert, you can still, like, learn and get the focus really fast without having to go through, like, a whole bunch of text. It's really, I think that it was really well, it's well written for for the subject, just to kind of get your feet into, like, the meat and potatoes of that before you see 200 just photos,
Yeah, so, well, there's a publishing choice when you've got photo books with how much text you put in it. So do you have chapters at all, right? So a photo book, it could just be just photographs and captions. So the only text could be the captions. Now this book has decided to have chapters too, and then the chapters are just a couple of pages long. And to be fair to the author, so he's generally trying to preview the photographs by saying, these are the tanks that are being used in this campaign. This is how they're structured. This is how they changed.
Yeah.
And then it's into the photographs, and you got lots of captions. So the choice, if you go with just captions, so no chapters, just captions, you have to use the captions to insert some of that more generalizable knowledge. So you will say, like, so I'm on page 10. So page 10, there's a lovely photograph here of a Panzer 1. It's a close-up of the crew, lots of crewmen in training. So you've got close-ups of the clothing and the berets they're wearing, and the way the machine guns are covered against to stop them getting dirty. And there's close-ups that give you sufficient insight into the camouflage. So there's a two-tone camouflage scheme on this tank, so two very close colours, a brown and a green, and it's sort of mottled. So you've got this close-up of that, and that's all great. So your caption could point out those things. So this is the uniform they're using before the war. The machine gun is an MG-13K. Those are the sort of details you want to put in a caption for this photograph, because those details are particular to this photograph. At the same time, you might then use another caption. So if we go on to page 13, 1.3, the author here is giving you extra information about how the Panzer II developed. So he's giving you an overview of the various variants the Panzer II went through. So that's not particular to the photograph. It's more general knowledge. So it's not, in a way, it doesn't belong in the caption. But if you're not going to have chapters that give that information, you have to stick it in the captions to give that generalizable knowledge as the author goes along. Now, interestingly, this book does both of those things, and that can be a bit tedious, because you start the campaign with a chapter which tells you the Panzer II is going to go through these variants, and it's going to have these guns. These new variants are going to have bigger guns. These are the bigger guns. And then you get to the photographs, and at various points he's telling you exactly the same thing. So that can be kind of tedious, right? So that's something to be aware of. But there's something to be said for a bit of redundancy and a bit of repetition, because you forget.
Yeah, also true. I mean, if it's relevant and you have a photo there that kind of shows it, it kind of helps the information stick from a reader's perspective. That's kind of how I feel about it. A little bit of repetition actually kind of helps me learn.
Yeah.
But like as you mentioned, it can be kind of tedious if it's overdone with that, if you have chapters too. But I feel like when I was reading through this the first time, I was kind of ready for like a lot of text, just because. But I was like, okay, but it's not so light on text that I feel like it's just a photo book,
Well, it can be a bit difficult as the reader, because you're thinking to yourself, I've read the chapter. That was the text, right? That was the general history and preview of the campaign. Now I'm in the photographs. Now I'm going to read about this particular photograph. So when the author suddenly switches to telling you general information, it's a bit of a, it's a bit, what's the right word? It sort of disturbs your flow, because you're focused on this photograph. You want to know what's going on in this photograph. And instead you're being told about the general history of the Panzer II. So it can be, and if that keeps happening, it just disturbs the flow, right? There's a trick to it. It's a stylistic trick. You, as the author of these captions, you have to know how much the reader really wants to know in general terms under this particular photograph.
Yeah.
And how much detail do you want to get into with this particular photograph? For me, you can tell me if I'm wrong, but there were a few times where I've got long captions. So like on page 19, there's a long caption which I think is justified, because it's telling me about the configuration of that particular tank in the photograph. And I can look at the photograph, and I can look back at the caption, and he's telling me about the bow machine gun. Then I can look back at the photograph, right? So now I've got some synergy and some complementarity between the caption and the photograph. But there's other times where I just want to look at the photograph. I just want you to tell me about the photograph. Don't tell me about anything else. Just tell me about the photograph. I don't want to know about the general course of the campaign, right? Because it's a photo book.
Yeah. Because I like, when I was kind of reading through this, when I really, I like to have text plus images, because anything that's more real, anything that's more tangible helps me understand the information and how to think with it, right? So in some of these, like as you mentioned, not only does he not have sources, but a lot of times, and again, not guessing is totally fine. I think it's totally fine to not guess and not be wrong. But sometimes I'm like, man, I want a little bit more context for what's happening in the photo. I don't know if he just decided to leave that out, or if he doesn't have the information. If you don't have the information, totally fine. Do not lie to me. Don't say something that just sounds cool,
right.
100%. If you don't have the information, but you have an original photo and you know what's in the image on the tank, just show me that. That's fine. But as the reader, I would rather have, like on this page 19 with this like big old caption that's talking about the configurations with, okay, good, the crew is here, the machine guns are here, and this is what they are. I would like that more than a wall of text just telling me. And when I'm making a YouTube video talking about a tank, I'm like, I want to put a picture of what I'm talking about, because I know that people might not be able to grasp it. Some people are more visual learners than textual learners, so you really want to make sure that you have at least a balance for your readers who may not just love, like, just hella text, you know? And some people do love hella text, there's times for that, but I think if you're trying to learn about tanks, it really helps to have a photo that shows it along with the caption. So me personally, while somebody in the chat says literary whiplash, like that's kind of how, you know, if he does that too much, it's a little bit like, oh god, you know. But I really like having a little bit of like you mentioned, it would have been cool. He said pre-war in that photo with all the crewmen. He says pre-war. He does. But it would have been cool, like, to mention, you know, the berets or the uniforms, or he actually didn't mention the camo in that photo at all. So I'm busy looking at the faces of all the people, and I'm not going to look for the camo, but if he said this is an early kind of camo, or this wasn't seen anywhere else, it's considered non-standard, whatever information that he has for that would have been cool to put in the caption, and I wouldn't have thought it's like, oh, you know, that's too much. But again, like you said, it's a stylistic preference of the author to be able to place that.
And in a way, if the author or the series editor had said, as a rule, we're only going to talk about the photograph in the captions.
Yes.
That gives a discipline to the author to say, let me find more and more detail in that photograph that I can point out to the reader. So if your captions are going to be about just the photograph, it helps the author to go into more detail, to find detail, because sometimes, you know, you can spend a few seconds looking at this photograph and you don't realize what's important to it, and then you look at it with more attention and you realize, you know, there's a non-standard weapon on that, or what are they doing in the background there? They seem to be digging in that tank. Why would they be digging it in there, right? So sometimes you can it pays you to spend more attention looking in detail. And in a book like that, which is a photo book, we're going to rely on the author to tell us where to look. You know, if there's something novel or surprising about this photograph, please tell me through your caption. You, the author, please tell me through your caption to go look in that top corner of the photograph where there's something really unusual going on. Because I'm just reading your book and I may skip through it and miss the detail. You've got to tell me.
Yeah.
So, you know, a photo book that is just dedicated to the captions is one that you would more likely expect to have more of those details that you would otherwise miss, because you're not selecting the photographs, you're not perusing the original photographs, because that's another thing. I can tell you this, looking at the original photographs in the archives can allow you to spot things that you would not spot when they're printed in a book, because then you got the original quality, the higher resolution, the original print. You can put a magnifying glass on it, so you can spot things that you wouldn't spot when it's printed. And then, you know, to go the other way, you've got chapters starting off this book. In a photo book, that can be a bit disturbing too, because you're reading about the tank. So it's saying, you know, the Model A did this and the Model B did this, and I've got no photographs. You know, I want to get on to the photographs, because you're telling me it has a bigger gun. I want to see the gun.
Right.
So it's, when I'm reading the chapters, it's almost like I want to read the chapters and get onto the photographs, because now you're telling me that this variant looks different to that other variant. Well, I need to see photographs. Illustrate it for me. So, you know, that's the downside with having chapters separated from photographs, right?